Bonsoir à celles et ceux qui viennent de nous rejoindre. Merci d'être avec nous. Je vous rappelle qu'il faut vous munir de cet outil technologique d'une puissance extraordinaire qui vous aidera à suivre les échanges qui vont arriver dans quelques instants, puisqu'il y aura de la traduction. Payer ses impôts, trouver un travail, créer son entreprise aujourd'hui, n'importe quel service public semble avoir pris au sérieux la transition numérique et propose des services en ligne. Symbole d'efficacité, volonté de diminution des coûts, cette dématérialisation n'en demeure pas moins critiquée. Celle-ci serait injuste pour certains, notamment les plus précaires et les moins compétents dans le domaine. 12% des Français ne se connectent d'ailleurs jamais à Internet et 20% des internautes ne se déclarent pas à l'aise avec l'outil. Alors que la notion d'électronisme fait son apparition dans le débat public, où en sommes-nous de l'inclusion des citoyens en France et en Europe? L'objectif du gouvernement d'une dématérialisation totale des démarches administratives d'ici 2022 est-il même souhaitable? Pour en débattre, voici Francesca Bria et Jen Shredy autour de Clémentine Malgras, qui est directrice conseil éditorial et communication chez Stroïka. Elle sera notre modératrice. On peut les applaudir chaleureusement.
Bonsoir à tous. Donc, merci d'être aussi nombreux pour cette discussion qui portera donc sur le sujet de la dématérialisation des services publics. J'aimerais peut-être qu'on commence par vous faire réagir sur les chiffres qui ont été annoncés. Donc 12% des Français qui ne se connectent pas du tout à Internet. 40% même des Français, selon une étude, qui sont inquiets à l'idée d'effectuer leurs démarches en ligne. Qu'est-ce que ça nous dit finalement? Qu'est-ce que vous pensez de ces chiffres, Jen Shredy?
Oui, bonjour tout le monde. Je parle en anglais, s'il vous plaît. So yes, that 12% number here in France is pretty similar to levels of the lack of access to the internet in the developing world. So you have a similar number in the United States, Canada, and much of Western Europe. And the challenge is that it's not just the lack of access to the internet, which is an important facet in and of itself, but even among those 88% who are online, a lot of people still don't necessarily have consistent access, right? So whether or not people have to drive to a relative's house to use the internet, or their computer stops working and people may not have the resources to get it going. And it's not always the elderly. I think that's a myth, that we have this sense that, well, once all the old people eventually die out, then everything will be fine. That's not the case at all. And certainly in rural areas, it's much worse, especially access to high-speed internet access. There are a lot of folks here in France. I was just up in Normandy village where people didn't have high-speed internet access, and it was a real problem. But the other issue is also in urban areas. I teach a class, I'm a professor, researcher, and professor at Sciences Po, and one of my exercises that I have my students do is go to a library, a bibliothèque in a banlieue, without their cell phone, so that's a challenge in and of itself, and try to use the computers at these libraries, which a lot of people rely on. And if you think about the topic for today around accessing city services online, if you're not able to do it at any point, like many of us here, I imagine most people here have a smartphone and maybe a computer at home, that presents a particular challenge. And the percentage that you gave, the 40% of people who also have some questioning, some fear around doing a lot of this online activity, that's something that I've also found in my research, that it's a question of skills. It's not only assets, it's skills, sometimes fear, and also just not feeling empowered to go online.
Pour vous présenter et pour présenter assez rapidement ce qui vous occupe aujourd'hui, donc vous êtes sociologue et vous travaillez à l'Observatoire sociologique de Sciences Po. Et vous avez donc votre recherche, elle porte sur la société numérique et notamment sur la question des inégalités. Vous venez là de publier un livre qui s'appelle « La révolution n'a pas eu lieu » ou « Comment l'activisme numérique favorise les conservateurs ». Et j'aimerais peut-être poursuivre sur cette question-là, de savoir finalement l'idée d'Internet, quand elle est apparue, c'était un mythe de démocratie, l'idée qu'avec Internet, tout le monde allait pouvoir finalement acquérir les mêmes droits. Et on voit bien aujourd'hui qu'il y a quand même un écart. Donc est-ce que vous pouvez peut-être répondre là-dessus et puis ensuite on enchaînera?
Oui, yeah, so a digital revolution, right? That's in many ways what my research does address, this idea that was a very utopian sense that the internet would create a variety of ways in which a lot of people could participate in society, whether it's the economy, in politics, etc. And so my research in general has looked at what the reality is, especially around, as you mentioned, inequalities. And yeah, so my latest book that just came out with Harvard University Press, The Revolution That Wasn't, addresses this utopianism around the internet, specifically with digital activism, right? So social movements and how they may or may not be using the internet, right? Which is especially, I think, prescient today with the one-year anniversary of the Gilets jaunes, which has been called a Facebook revolution, just like the Arab Spring, a lot of the protests there, or Occupy Wall Street, or the Indignados was also called Facebook or Twitter revolutions. Again, this idea that the internet could enable more political participation, could allow a lot more people to not only participate in a social movement, but in society and politics at large. And so what my book does is it traces, rather than just these spikes of these protest movements, how do everyday people, right? How do people, not just at a protest, but how do people participate in social movement activity overall, political activity, maybe through a labor movement as well, and really tackles this question. And what I find is there's a pretty wide digital activism gap, right? So yes, as the book's titled, conservative groups rather than left-wing groups are much more likely over time to use the internet for their political purposes, as well as groups that are more hierarchical rather than horizontal. So both of those kind of challenge this idea of the internet being this very horizontal way for people to participate. But the biggest gap that I found was with differences of people from different social classes. The middle to upper class activists were much more likely to have the resources, the time, the skills, the empowerment to be very active online, whether it was through Twitter or Facebook or through websites or other ways that at this point, journalists, researchers like myself and other people are tracking these social movements online. But if we're only looking to a hashtag to analyze what's happening, we may be missing some very important voices politically.
Francesca Bria, justement, sur cette question de l'activisme numérique, vous êtes professeur et vous êtes aussi chercheur, vous êtes aussi responsable du numérique et de l'innovation pour la ville de Barcelone. Vous avez lancé et co-créé un projet qui s'appelle Decode, qui est un projet européen qui traite de la souveraineté des données. Quelle réaction vous pouvez avoir par rapport à cette question-là, cette question de l'écart entre ceux qui savent utiliser les outils pour se mobiliser d'un point de vue démocratique, pour la démocratie, et ceux qui en sont éloignés?
Thanks for the question. I think it's very important to broaden up the debate when we talk about what it means, our digital life. So I think, for instance, that only to measure digital divide as in terms of internet access is not enough. Of course, broadband penetration is important, but at this point is much more important the question around education, inclusion, empowerment, and really what do you do with the access to knowledge and information, to critical knowledge, hopefully, and information. So I think it's a little bit misleading to only look at the internet, first of all, which anyways, the narrative around internet and politics, I think it came even historically much more from an Anglo-Saxon world. I mean, even the internet as a narrative of, emancipation from the very beginning, it was very differently playing out in many regions of the world. So, for example, in Europe, I think we have a broad tradition of civic technologies and technologies for the public space and for citizens that are really not commercial technologies and not technologies for surveillance. I mean, it's technologies for the daily life of citizens, what we call like civic technologies or public technology. And I think that at this point it's very important to realize that, when we talk about digitalization of governments, and then I will get to the point of activism, because I think, again, this is our political question, how you shape technology. And I can give you a lot of examples about emancipatory movements that are using technology, but maybe it's not Facebook, and it's not Twitter, and it's not hashtags only, so it is really about techno-political organizations. And this is happening, I think, everywhere. So I guess at the beginning of the kind of digital revolution, as you call it, we are thinking about digitalization as, even today in governments, if I tell you what the government do with the digital, you think they're fixing computers, they're buying licenses from Microsoft, or they're just, selling, they're just buying technologies from the tech giants. And you don't think that digitalization of government and of society really means posing fundamental questions about how we see our society in the future, how we are going to reorganize our healthcare system, how we're going to reorganize education, public transportation, just because technology happened to be data, connectivity, sensors, a fundamental infrastructure of our daily life. So I'm arguing that it's a very important political and economic choice which has to be discussed with society. Who owns what kind of infrastructural choices we make, who is controlling our data, which of course is a very political question, and how we may imagine different forms of social organization that of course have to deal with technology, because this is the current material infrastructures that we have to run society. So I think more and more we need to emancipate ourselves from a kind of big tech-centric and even an internet-centric narrative about what the digital can be. And coming to the activism point, I've been the Chief Technology and Digital Innovation Officer of Barcelona for the last 4 years. And there we have really a large-scale participatory democracy movement of citizens using also technology to participate actively in the life of citizens, in the life of the city. So for instance, we created a platform, it's called Decidi in Barcelona, Barcelona Decide. And this is a free software platform, so actually it's not Facebook, it's not Google, it's a civic technology. The platform is owned and controlled by citizens. It is paid with public money, but we use open source software, we use open standards. You can actually check who accesses the data, and the data is owned by the citizens, so there is no manipulation, there is no interference, there is no surveillance, commercial or political surveillance. And 400,000 citizens use this platform to engage with the mayor of Barcelona and to the city hall and to create the priorities regarding education, healthcare, the future of mobility, fight against climate change, affordable housing. So we were really using this platform, but not only the platform, of course it was online and offline hybrid participatory democracy approach to get more power to the citizens. On top of that, we created this Decode platform, which is a decentralized technology with cryptography. So it's a protocol, cryptographic protocol, that enables the citizens to decide what data they want to keep private, what data they want to share, with whom they're sharing the data, and what is the terms of sharing the data. So today, if you access any technology, any digital service from your mobile phone, by the way, we have to also calculate that many citizens don't have fiber access or fixed fiber, but they connect through the mobile phone. and this is also maybe a problem of the divide, but anyways, this is happening. And you access the digital application, and the terms of service are set by the company, Google or Facebook, and we don't read those terms of service, but they're very important. They tell you what rights you have, who owns the data, what they can do with your data. They can sell your data to an advertising company. Is your data accessed for what purpose? So we turn that into a democratic agreement between the city and the citizen. And we also created government clauses in procurement contracts that are oblige any provider that access any service, produce service in the city of Barcelona, to give back the data to the citizens and make sure that this data become a public infrastructure, like a public service, really. And you can do a lot in public administration. You can transition, instead of buying all the products from Microsoft and Google, you can invest in open source software. You can work in interoperable standards. So these are all laws and rules that public administration should put in the contracts when they deal with government services, and make sure that we respect citizen rights, and we have an idea of technology which is emancipatory, which is democratic, because who set the rules of the game? This is the big question for me, because there is no doubt that you're going to have a lot of power if you control technology, artificial intelligence, and connectivity, which are, again, basic infrastructure, but who controls those infrastructure, and do we have the public power, elected governments and citizens, to set the rules of the game when it comes to the use of technology, which also means to decide if we're having big tech control only, or if we can have democratic technology for emancipatory society. And I think this is not, I mean, we can debate this, but I don't think this is the utopic vision about the internet that we said at the very beginning. I think that we realize that there is a lot of power in controlling the basic infrastructure that organize society. And as a society, for instance, today there is a big article on Le Monde about facial recognition, and if facial recognition in France should be deployed, integrated to payment systems. I think these are highly political choices that we cannot delegate to a big tech company. It cannot be Google to make this choice for the European citizen. It cannot be Facebook. It also cannot be Apple or the Chinese tech giants. It has to be our society in a democratic way that decide how we can collectively use technology with people and rights at the very center to build the society of the future. So that's where I think, we have to kind of shift into a space for building democratic technologies or public tech, which really serve the interests of people and not just the profit for few companies.
Ce qu'on voit, c'est en effet ce que vous nous avez expliqué, et l'exemple que vous prenez de la ville de Barcelone montre bien qu'il y a en fait que la décision de dématérialiser les services publics, elle est hautement politique, que derrière c'est une idéologie, aussi une certaine vision en fait du numérique qui nous est fait. La sensation qu'on a sur le débat autour de la dématérialisation des services publics aujourd'hui, c'est que nous, en tant que citoyens, nous en sommes des usagers. C'est-à-dire que l'accompagnement, la dimension citoyenne, la dimension participative, elle est principalement concentrée sur l'usage et l'accompagnement à l'usage. Il ne s'agit pas de nous donner la possibilité de co-créer peut-être, ou en tout cas d'être impliqués dans les décisions stratégiques qui président à l'installation de ce type d'infrastructure, mais il s'agit vraiment plutôt de nous accompagner et de nous accompagner de différentes manières. Mais il y a eu donc un programme sur l'inclusion numérique, c'est-à-dire de faire en sorte que tout le monde soit connecté et soit capable d'utiliser ces outils, sans pour autant qu'on soit en mesure de nous prendre part à la décision des choix des outils, comme vous le mentionniez, mais aussi de ce pourquoi nos données sont utilisées, etc. Comment est-ce que, et peut-être là-dessus votre regard aussi de sociologue, comment est-ce qu'on fait pour dépasser cette dichotomie qu'on a entre d'un côté un usager et de l'autre un producteur, un acteur aussi des technologies numériques?
So yeah, I mean, I think you made a good point earlier around really trying to differentiate when we're talking about democratic technology, right, and what that actually means. And specifically, when we use the term fracture numérique or the digital divide, initially when scholars started using that term, it was a very simple divide, right? Do people have access to a computer or not? Do they have access, as I said, to high-speed internet or not? And scholars have started using the term digital inequalities, right? Les inégalités, because not only are there different types of access, right? But one of my first articles that I published on this question differentiated between the consumption of online content and the production, right? Who is actually producing online content? And found pretty substantial social class divisions, right? Which continue. And it's interesting, you know, when you were talking about, I think it's a good point to go outside of just the internet and look more broadly, and, you know, the program that you've launched in Barcelona is super impressive in terms of trying to democratize what's happening. But it's interesting today as we see the, you know, big tech companies that you mentioned, you know, kind of the face of big tech right now is often Mark Zuckerberg, or the other kind of digital dystopian era, you know, symbol right now might be Vladimir Putin and Russian bots, or even Donald Trump and his toxic tweets. But the problem with just looking toward these villains, these evil tech villains, is that even if we completely developed our own platforms that were very democratic, right, there would still be these structural inequalities, right, where people, you would still have these social class and other divisions of some people being able to access, not only access some of these services, but really be a part of developing them and participating politically, right? So we have this tendency, if people are familiar with, you know, Monty Python's, you know, the Holy Grail, right? We're always searching for the Holy Grail. We're trying to find some way to get our internet back, right? If only we could have our internet back. But the reality is that it was never the people's internet to begin with. It was developed by largely the military, other university researchers, et cetera. It was always a system of the elite. And it will take a pretty substantial transformation in society to change that. But I think we're talking, you know, I'm talking very broadly right now politically, but there's the very basic way that, you know, you had mentioned some people still rely on smartphones for their internet access, right? And you know, there has been this issue that I've talked to some of my students and others, you know, trying to sign into Parcoursup, right? The way to apply for college to university in France. Trying to do that on your smartphone is incredibly difficult. Trying to pay your taxes, I have a hard enough time here in France doing that with, you know, with my laptop, right? So there's so many ways in which these systems that are developed by people with more resources, with more income, with more education, without really understanding, A, how everyday people are actually using these technologies, but how these inequalities and these broader differences can really prevent this full digital democracy that was this initial idea of the internet.
Yes, I mean, I want to give a message that is actually very important that citizens understand what kind of power they have over these decisions. So for instance, I think it's very important that you realize how technology is linked to some of the basic services that you have access if you are just a citizen vis-a-vis your government. You know, how this is shaping healthcare, how this is shaping your access to housing, the mobility services. I mean, technology is a very important part in all of these basic services that you all the time, you know, interact to government to have access to, at least in Europe. Still, a lot of these services are public and they are delivered, I mean, mainly at the local level, but also at the national level. And at the moment, for instance, in Europe, we're having a strong debate about digital payments and how we're gonna digitalize the payment of taxes, or how we're gonna, you know, eliminate cash and introduce a digital system. if this digital payment system should be linked to our identity and to make our identity also digital, and who is going to have the right to cross all this data in order to identify if we are a good citizen, if we pay taxes, and all the other informations that now really it's in the hands of very few companies. Not governments even, very few companies. So at the moment, you know, you have companies like Google and Facebook and very few other companies that are able to aggregate all our data, you know who we are, who are our friends, where we go, what we like, what's our best background, the mail we write all the time, our payments, and they are aggregating a lot of power, and through their artificial intelligence systems, they're starting selling governments not only cloud computing, which is a basic infrastructure where we're going to put all these services in the future and today also, but also to sell the data back. So we as citizens, not only we don't have the power to shape those policies, we also get to pay twice. When we pay the taxes, and then we are going to get to pay them back to basically use our data. I mean, this is data belong to us. So it's extremely unequal exchange. And I think we have to start asking those questions to policymakers. I mean, I'm becoming a bit more optimistic here because we also have a new generation of policymakers coming into power, which are younger. They also more sensitive about all these class divides, but also about, you know, the basic things about technology. And they're starting to ask those questions, you know. So you should ask the contracts. We should be able to see the big contracts that governments do with technology companies. You want to know if a company like Palantir, which is a big military contractor in the US, is accessing your healthcare data, and if a government is giving access to Google, for instance, to manage your healthcare data. I mean, now there is an outcry because 50 million US citizens' data, I mean, the record, a medical record, is in the hands of Google, which is doing, I mean, nobody really knows what they're doing with this data, but they definitely didn't ask the citizens for consent. So all these choices are deeply political, and they will influence our society in the future. Who has power, what kind of services we're gonna get, and who decides on what. And I just to end this kind of thinking, I work, for instance, my mayor, Ada Colau, I mean, now I work for the United Nations as an advisor on digital cities and digital rights. But until September, I used to be the head of the smart city in Barcelona. And the mayor of Barcelona, she's not technological. But, you know, she started to be very active on these questions because of Uber and Airbnb. So the mayor of Barcelona, she has as core agenda in the city, affordable housing. And she really cared that people have access to affordable housing. And so she started a big battle with Airbnb because the model of these platforms was really against affordable housing, because all of a sudden it's impossible for many European cities to even afford to pay a rent because the rent has increased 60% in like 3 years' time. Barcelona, Amsterdam, Berlin, Paris, it's now almost impossible to rent a house in the city center. So she started to understand that, you know, you have these big platforms, and of course they break a lot of different regulations, they don't pay taxes, a lot of different things, but the power they have, accessing all our data, accessing the data, I mean, to know the price of the different part of the neighborhoods, they start to have much more data than the regulator. And if I'm a regulator and I want to regulate like what they can do and cannot do in my city, I'm not sovereign anymore. It's very hard to do it. And the same thing with Uber, which is a company that affects our working condition because they're precarizing jobs, they're very much changing the labor market. So all of a sudden, technology problems, or so-called technology problems, are becoming citizens' problems. What's with the future of job? What is about access to housing? Who owns the public space? Who owns your healthcare data? So these are the fundamental questions, which anyways in our tradition in Europe are the questions about the welfare state. And that it's where I think we need to have a very strong conversation regarding public power and private power, but also a new social contract for this digital transition that has to be set by all of us. And I think we are in urgency of setting those rules and making sure that we can advance in a society that's less dystopic.
Bien sûr, et quand bien même, une question aussi qui se pose, c'est que quand bien même on pourrait mettre en œuvre et on avancerait sur ces questions-là en sensibilisant les citoyens, la question qui se pose, c'est aussi la continuité. Dès l'instant que ces questions-là sont des choix politiques, et on voit en ce moment qu'il y a quand même des bouleversements politiques majeurs, comment est-ce qu'on s'assure que les systèmes plus vertueux, plus éthiques, plus responsables qui sont mis en place sont en mesure de rester dans le temps et de ne pas être complètement mis à plat, par exemple, par une succession politique qui ne verrait pas la chose de cette manière. Et sur cette question-là, par exemple, est-ce que vous vous interrogez sur qu'est-ce qui se passera quand pour la prochaine mairie à Barcelone?
Yeah. I think this is a very good question, and I think, of course, I mean, we live in a democracy, so all the time there is going to be, I mean, politician change, and people express, you know, we vote about things, and I actually think the participatory democracy, the extension of participatory democracy, it's a very good thing, which means creates new spaces and more spaces for citizen involvement, but also citizen pressure. So when I'm really talking about these things, I don't mean that you have to trust the politician or trust the mayor that will just do the right thing. I think that we can only do the right thing when we are in the institutions if there is a constant actual monitoring and pressure coming from citizens. And where this is not there, and where if the only people that come to me as a policymakers are the lobbyists, so if I only have the Googles and the Facebook and the Microsoft and whatever coming to me, obviously I will do certain policies that favor their interests or their profits, and I won't take into account people that don't have access or don't have even the ability to pay for services or come from a different background or come from a different ethnical background. Obviously I won't. So I think the answer to that is that you need a constant activity from citizens actually. Mm-hmm. And I think that you can do a lot of things in the public sector to demand that there is this much more openness in the way we run things. For instance, in Barcelona, we've been doing a lot about, I mean, I don't believe in this idea of full transparency, right, as such. But I think, of course, if I do a lot to educate, to help citizens to understand what is happening with governments, how we take decisions, where is the budget, how we invest the budget, how we take decisions, obviously I put people in the condition to be much more able to, to exercise power over public institutions. And one thing that we also did is create physical spaces, because I think I really agree with the fact, not many people have the time, the background, the capacity to interact, not only with online systems, also with actual institutions, with any kind of system. And so what we've done is we created spaces physically in neighborhoods, which we call them Center for Democratic Innovation, where citizens can go in, and you can see what is happening, also through our platform, how decisions are taken, what is happening. And citizens have the capacity to debate, to express, their opinions, and to be part of this broader conversation. So for me, this is the way to do it. You cannot imagine that, politicians will keep changing, and you have to make sure that people have more power, basically.
Alors justement, Jen Tradi,
Yeah.
qu'est-ce que ça vous évoque, finalement ce retour pour pouvoir exercer une pression politique aussi sur notre gouvernement et pouvoir prendre des décisions, il faut aussi qu'on ait un certain bagage, et vous, c'est aussi le sens de votre travail que d'observer qu'il y a des différences. Tout le monde n'est pas égaux en fait devant la question des droits que nous avons sur les outils numériques et sur les gouvernements.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as an American living in France, right? Having seen, experienced both systems, just as a way to kind of look at that comparison. And I think you're right about, countries like France that have a stronger welfare state and are more, so much more is nationalized, even to have a parcours soup, right? That the educational system is nationalized. As a result, the systems, I think, overall work much better. In the US, there isn't there isn't a national way to file our taxes. There are all these corporations that will do that, but there's not a nationalized system. And that's kind of the interesting irony here, right? So one of the ideas of the internet is that individuals, right? So there's this broad idea of networked individualism, not individualistic, but individualism, right? We can all participate in society as individuals, but the problem is that if you look at, what happened with the Minitel in France, which I think is really important to talk about here in terms of public services. I mean, France was ahead of the entire world with the Minitel, and people sometimes joke about it, but it was extremely advanced at the time. The problem was that it wasn't integrated more broadly to the rest of the world like the World Wide Web, and it has eventually died out. And so I think the more successful systems are those that are more distributed, and that's the tricky balance, right? Google, Facebook, these big tech platforms are so successful because so many people are using them. And as an American, it's actually wonderful in a lot of ways, some of these nationalized systems. Actually, despite how hard it is language-wise, paying taxes in France is so much easier because I can just do it online. And when I've seen different bureaucracies in France transfer online, because it's nationalized, it's so much faster than all these different pockets of a city or a state in the United States, which is doing it on a more individual basis. So I think that's the balance of reaching a broad group of people, making decisions that can affect a lot of folks, but at the same time, having that more local participatory control at the same time.
On va peut-être passer aux questions maintenant. Si vous avez des questions à poser, n'hésitez pas. Vous pouvez les poser en français et si besoin, je traduirai. Alors... Merci.
Hi, first of all, thanks for the talk.
On vous entend pas très bien. Est-ce que vous pouvez rapprocher?
Okay, first of all, thanks for the talk. My question is to Ms. The one in the middle, sorry, I forgot the name. But which percentage of people doesn't have this regular access to internet, saying that we don't have a computer and internet at home? Which percentage of people is that today? And how much was it in the past, and what's the development?
So the question is around how given the 12%, for example, access, what kind of the trajectory is and what kind of the history of digital inequality has been and maybe where we're going. Is that a good way to rephrase your question? I hope it is.
Yes.
I can't see you. Okay, great. Excellent question. So it's interesting because people who study adoption of new technologies or new medications or anything new, any innovation, right? So there's a whole area of research that looks at this. And it's often followed what's called an S-curve, right? You have these early adopters, right? So kind of quickly adopting, and then you have kind of a steady increase. And we saw that with the internet, right? And then over time, it reaches full saturation. So we've found that with other technologies like the telephone or the television, that eventually over time, the top of the S-curve reached to almost 99, 100% adoption. The tricky thing with the internet is that it's extremely different from other forms of technology. So that yes, initially with internet adoption, you had the early adopters, maybe 3 or 4%, and then over, especially we had a huge increase in the 1990s. France was a little farther down, I think because of the Minitel, but you still saw that increase. But now both France and the US are pretty much about at that 12%. And it's been steady, right? So it's not going up. We're kind of at the top of that S-curve, but it might creep up a little bit. But the problem is that because there are so many different ways to access digital technologies, right? Whether it's smartphones, laptops, so many different kinds of gadgets. And even if you have it, having all the different types of software and really understanding how to use them. And that's where both access and skills come in, absolutely. And so the end result is because technology wears out, and we know there have been all these controversies around big tech, Apple in particular, right, kind of phasing out their technology. We still in our household have an iPhone 4, thank you very much. But it's hard, right? It can't be updated, it doesn't do much, right? And so the challenge is it's like a race constantly. You just can never get to the finish line because there are always updates, there's new platforms, there's new gadgets, and that unless there is massive involvement by the state or other ways, but probably by the state, to enable full internet access and access to tools, we're never going to catch up. And yes, for example, I know in Occitanie here in Toulouse that high school students get access to a laptop when they start lycée, but and it's great, like that's a good step, but they're not fast. They're really slow, they're heavy, they're limited in terms of what people can do. So it's a step, but there's still that digital inequality that persists.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions, peut-être, dans la salle?
N'hésitez pas à lever la main. Je ne veux pas vous faire culpabiliser, mais dans les autres sessions, les gens étaient un peu plus audacieux. Monsieur.
Vous avez parlé de l'expérimentation à Barcelone. Est-ce que vous avez des exemples de services publics proposés à la population à Barcelone? Et quel a été le pourcentage d'adoption de ces services par les Barcelonais?
Yes, so I think the process of digitalization when it comes to access of digital services in Barcelona is very high. I think we're talking over 70% of people. I mean, we have been digitalizing the ID, so the kind of like your digital identity. And so you can get your digital ID, you can pay your taxes, you can access different kind of services from your transportation application to know, what is the best route. We've been doing a lot of work to integrate the different transport systems. We worked a lot on mobility and make sure that you pay an integrated ticket. So we have like integrating all the different like trams and buses and metro and the taxi also, which are public in Barcelona. And so we've been working a lot on one transit ticket so that you can choose the best transportation system. But I think it went beyond that. When it comes to mobility, it has been very important. I talked it in the panel before, but we transformed the city radically. This involves also digital technology, so we closed to 12 districts of the city to traffic in order to fight the CO2 emission and to make sure we have a more green city. And so we transform all the transit in the city. So there are spaces where you can only go by bicycle. So we tripled the bicycle lane, and you have now 3,000 of electric bicycles that you can use everywhere. I see that here you have a lot of problems to regulate the new micromobility services. In Barcelona, we have a new legislation that regulates how companies can use these little scooters to make sure that they just, that there is more space for pedestrians. This has been our really objective. We do a lot of things when it comes to transparency and against corruption. So we are, I think, the first city in the world that implemented something we call Bustia Etica, which is an ethical, so it's an application where you can maintain your anonymity as a citizen or even as a public worker, and you can file cases of corruption to the city hall. We use the same technology that WikiLeaks uses, which is called Tor. So we incentivize citizens to denounce, so if you know of anything like a whistleblower, basically infrastructure. And we received a lot of anti-corruption cases from public workers and citizens, and then we created a committee for transparency, and people are acting on those cases if they see any corruption cases in government. Then we publish a lot on open data, so we also work with data journalists so that they can have data to access, questions around the economic data of the city or new public space or questions around healthcare. So we publish all this data in an open data portal, and we also put the data open for innovators and startups to help us co-create services. I think Barcelona is one of the kind of digital cities that kind of work for everybody at the moment. Or at least we still have digital divide, of course, and we do have people that use less digital services. I think the key there is never to give the digital only. To never say digital is the only access to your services, but to have always physical spaces with real public workers that you can go to and you can have the same type of access in a different way.
Ce qui est justement l'enjeu dans la dématérialisation des services publics, ce qui ressort, c'est aussi la relation humaine avec la personne au guichet, la personne qui vous accompagne, qui est bien entendu essentielle, et c'est un des aspects qui génère le plus de crispation aussi de la part de la population quand elle n'a plus cette relation-là. On va peut-être prendre une dernière question.
Le jeune homme à la coiffure approximative ici.
Je te remercie.
Étienne Jernel, directeur du Point.
J'ai une question un peu politique. Et la contre-culture, historiquement, s'est beaucoup développée dans les villes, dans les grandes villes, parce que c'était là où on pouvait avoir d'abord des contacts, et puis c'est là où on pouvait se cacher plus facilement. Est-ce que la digitalisation des villes, la numérisation, et donc le contrôle ou le risque de contrôle, vous en avez parlé tout à l'heure, de la part des autorités publiques sur les citoyens, ne va pas pousser la contre-culture à aller dans la campagne? Est-ce qu'il ne va pas y avoir à l'avenir, je vous pose une question, c'est un peu une supputation, à l'avenir, des zones qui sont digital free, où on échappe à la culture? La littérature est pleine de ça, notamment Yevgeny Zamyatin dans Nous autres, qui est un chef-d'œuvre de la dystopie. Est-ce que finalement la liberté, un jour, sera plus à la campagne si on ne contrôle pas la gestion des datas et si on ne contrôle pas ceux qui contrôlent les datas, justement?
I hope I understood everything, and maybe you want to answer as well. I think it's a great provocation. Actually, no, it is, but it can also be elitist a little bit. So I usually resist to this idea that in order to be autonomous, free, and to have your rights as a collective or as an individual, you're going to have to go away from what society is building, because you have to escape an almost totalitarian surveillance system, which actually, is in place and can be abused by power if we do not exercise our collective rights. So I believe that rich people, because this is like a lot of rich people, are actually, not only the gilets jaunes here are like rioting in the street, but we also have the movement of a lot of rich people are the one that can afford to use privacy, to be disconnected, also because they have a lot of people working for them. They have a lot of people answering their emails. They don't need to be all the time connected. And then we have masses of precarious workers working for Uber and Deliveroo without any rights, and people that cannot afford to go to the countryside, right? So I think that we want to make, but also on that there is a very interesting thing. Rem Koolhaas, which is a great urbanist and architect, he's working on smart countrysides. In fact, he's countering the smart city idea, which saying this is a most important divide, and we're going to have to work to improve life in the countryside if we want to get to a better society. But my answer to that is we're going to have to struggle here to get a more inclusive, egalitarian, and democratic society, and to prevent that abuse of power, because not everybody will have the privilege to go and disconnect and be in the countryside.
I think that, on the general point of the kind of urban, rural, and making the choices, absolutely, when I, first presented my research about how a lot of poor and working class people just don't have the time. Like, that's a big mechanism of not being able to fully participate in digital society. People are having to, I talked to one worker, he has 12-hour shift. He's a nursing assistant. He has to hand over his mobile phone at the beginning of his shift. Again, this is in the US, but still. And then at the end of his shift, he gets his phone back and has to drive an hour each way. He lived in a very rural area, and so had very little time to participate. If he had some free time, he was going to sleep, he was going to eat, and maybe if he had to go online, it was to do the basics rather than this full digital participation. And often, you know, the response is, oh, well, I wish I wasn't online as much, and it's too much, and I'm overwhelmed. And I can definitely relate to that as someone who studies social media and therefore has to be on social media a lot. It's, you know, it can definitely be a slippery slope. But I think for many people, just to survive in society, even to apply for a job, often you have to do that online. And if you have to go to a public library to fill out an online application, sometimes you're limited to just 30 minutes. That may not be enough time if you're not literate enough to type very quickly or really follow and read the directions. So I agree that it is a privilege to choose not to be online as much, right? And that's something that you know, is kind of the trend with a lot of tech CEOs in Silicon Valley, limiting their kids' screen time, having a Sunday where there's no digital technology. But for a lot of people, that is not a choice. And I think in terms of, just to kind of maybe end on some of the solutions, because I'm the person who's telling you there are all these problems, right? And I'm listing them of digital inequality and all the challenges that people have, but I think what it's going to take, if you think about digital literacy, and you were telling me the word for it in French, which? Electronism. That just like in you know, Nicaragua or Cuba after the triumph of their revolutions, they had masses of people go out into the countryside for massive literacy campaigns. And I think that's something that we really need to think about on a wide scale. If we're going to convert so much of our public services online, we need to make sure that there are digital literacy campaigns in place to make that a reality.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à tous.
Merci à toutes les trois. On peut vous applaudir chaleureusement. Merci encore pour cette...